So, when we work out, we are going to see a decrease in pH or an increase in acidity. And the reason that's occurring is because we have three main factors for that. So, for the first one, what we see with the decrease in pH is the result of increased CO2 production within the tissues that are working during exercise. Usually CO2 is mainly coming from pyruvates releasing that that last carbon, like from Krebs or from glycolysis at the end. It releases that out as CO2, and that's going to release more and more CO2. Usually you're going to see that with the high intensity short duration because it's anaerobic. And also, that's not the only way CO2 is produced. You're also going to see it produced from being released throughout the Krebs cycle. We can actually just go back here and look. So, you can see that pyruvate is going to release one. It's going to create a CO2 and release one. But you're also going to see multiple CO2s be released throughout the Krebs cycle. What that does is it builds an accumulation, and you're going to just see increased acidity because when CO2 comes in contact with water, it is going to become carbonic acid. The second reason why we're going to see a decrease in pH is after a pyruvate is created, the aerobic system may not need to use the pyruvate that's created. And so that pyruvate will work towards lactate production. And lactate production is also going to create hydrogen ions. And we know that hydrogen ions are very acidic. These two are going to be known as lactic acid. And that's also going to be another reason why. I'll show back here. So we see here, if, let's say, those pyruvates aren't needed for this cycle right here, we're going to go ahead and not just throw them away. It's going to be used for something, and that's lactate production. So our third reason why is during ATP production, or ATP breakdown more specifically, hydrogen is going to be produced. So it's going to look like ATP is going to turn into ADP plus an inorganic phosphate plus a hydrogen. And the accumulation of hydrogen is going to create a more acidic environment. And so what the accumulation of just acidity in that general area, let's say when you're exercising, all of this are going to be the cause of exercise. You're going to see an increase of all of this due to exercise because you're working to run through your energy systems more rapidly. So when you see an increase in acidity, you're going to see a decrease in enzymatic function. And you're also going to see how that enzymatic function is going, see how it decreases. It's going to denature the proteins in those muscle cells, such as troponin and titin and tropomyosin. It's going to denature those, causing it to become rendered almost useless. It's just not going to work more efficiently the way it should. What happens here is that's going to lead into muscle fatigue. So with the muscle fatigue due to like acid buildup, we want to know it's not always, I mean, it's always going to happen, but there are ways that our body can try to combat this. Our body is kind of has a buffer system within us to delay that onset of fatigue. We have what's called our intracellular buffer systems, which are going to be in the muscle and are going to work their way to try to bring hydrogen out of the cell to keep it more or less acidic. Uh, Buffers. But what we're focused on is during ventilation. We want to know how ventilation can help with that buffer. And that is going to be an extracellular buffer system called the bicarbonate buffer system. So, in kind of a recap, during exercise, what we're going to see here is more of a decrease in pH levels, which what that does is it's going to allow oxygen to become more able to unbind with the hemoglobin due to the denaturing factors of acidity on the hemoglobin. So oxygen is going to be easy to deliver to the muscles that are working really hard. That's going to be that right shift of the dissociation curve. Drop off. That allows those muscles to kind of attach, or not attach, to retain those oxygen to kind of keep the aerobic energy systems going. But what you're going to see during this whole process of exercise is our blood is going to work really hard to try to maintain normal pH levels, and that's used with the bicarbonate buffer system. And what that looks like is you're going to see CO2 plus H2O converts into H2CO3 and can convert into HCO3 plus hydrogen. This right here is called carbonic acid, and it's a weak acid. Anytime CO2 meets with water, it becomes an acid, but it's a very weak acid, so it's not as strong. And so we can see this happening throughout our tissues through ventilation. We have this graph right here that kind of explains it pretty well. So you see that diagram. So you see CO2 comes into contact with H2O. It's going to become H2CO3, which also can release its hydrogen ion to become HCO3 plus hydrogen. And this whole system can kind of work its way back and forth in order to maintain pH levels. So if the pH levels were too high, it'd be too basic, so it's going to start dissociating the hydrogen to lower the pH. And so now we'll look at the system that happens throughout our body when we're doing workouts and ventilation. So you're going to see the muscle tissue, it's going to have CO2 produced due to the pyruvates of the Krebs cycle and from the breakoff of glycolysis. It's going to attach to water, and what that's going to do is going to turn into H2CO3. That H2CO3 is going to dissociate back into HCO3 plus hydrogen. HCO3 is going to go into the bloodstream to be utilized in other areas as like a buffer. And that hydrogen is going to bind into the hemoglobin. What that does is it keeps it from becoming too acidic in the blood system. And so, if it accumulates too much, it will become acidic and that area will become fatigued. But the whole goal for this is for it to bind to this hemoglobin. And what it does is that hemoglobin is going to go all the way back. It's going to go through the heart and work its way to the lungs. And this is where HCO3 is important, because it's going to do is it's going to come back. Hemoglobin is going to release the hydrogen. It's going to bind back again with HCO3. You're going to see carbonic acid again is going to be produced, and then it's going to dissociate into CO2 plus H2O. And what that does, and that CO2 is going to be sent up into the alveoli of the lungs, and that CO2 is then going to be breathed out with expiration. And that is why ventilation is important for us during exercise, because when we can ventilate, we can get CO2 out of our body quickly, and we don't accumulate as much acidity in our muscles, and we can try to delay the onset of fatigue.